Okay, I'm gonna start. Hi everyone, my name is Nabila. I work for the Center for Teaching, Research and Learning. Before we get started, I want to mention a few things. Captioning is available for this session. To turn on captions, there should be an option at the bottom of the screen in the Zoom toolbar that says show subtitles. If you do not see it, you may need to click on more to see that option. And also there will be an anonymous survey posted at the end of the session as a QR code that you can scan with your phone. And I'm also going to drop a link in the chat. With that being said, I will turn it over to our presenters. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Justin Bernstein. I'm the Interim Dean of Students here at American University, and I'm very happy to be here presenting with two of my colleagues who I will let introduce themselves. Ash, do you want to go first?
Yeah, for sure. Hey, everybody. Ashley or Ash Polterchek. I use any and all pronouns, and I'm the Assistant Dean of Students. It's nice seeing you all.
Good afternoon. Oh, I'm so sorry. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Kenesha L. Rowe. I'm also the Assistant Dean of Students. I work in the Office for Student Accountability and Restorative Practices.
And we're excited to talk to you today about tools and restorative practices to support the whole student. I see a number of familiar faces and names in the participants. So I know many of you have already interacted with our offices, or we've worked with different students that you might be working with. But hopefully there's some new tips and tricks that you'll learn from this. And for those of you who haven't had the chance to work with our teams yet, you'll get to learn about some of the ways that we support students, as well as ways that you can continue to support students in their academic, emotional, social, all the different dimensions that they bring to the table. So here's a quick run through of what we're going to talk about today. As I said, this is what the session is about, supporting the whole student. And we really want this to be an interactive session. So we're going to have some breakouts. So hopefully folks will have a chance to reflect on what we've talked about in a smaller setting and then share out with the larger group. So Ash is going to kick us off with a quick self-reflection in a moment. And then Dr. Rowe will talk through the tools for restorative practices, and we'll do a case study related to that. And then Ash and I will go through tools from the Dean of Students office, and we'll do a case study regarding those. And we'll have time, hopefully, at the end for questions and for groups to share out from their breakout sessions.
And so, as Justin mentioned, I am a fan of a really good 1 minute, quick, brief self-reflection. So whether you are doing this in your own mind, if you're taking time to jot thoughts down, please just take 1 minute to yourself, and I will time it so that we stay on track. But thinking about, why did you sign up for this session? What are some of the ways in which you think that either having these tools potentially that we might talk through that are a mystery to you right now potentially either have been helpful or that you may want to be applying in the future? And so we're going to take that 1 minute right now. Thank you all very much for joining us in that brief moment. And I'm going to turn it right back over to Dr.
Thank you. Ooh, wrong way. Right way. Okay. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about restorative practices, about some of the theory behind this way of being. And some of you may already be familiar with restorative justice, restorative practices. At American University, we do take great intention in being intentional with our words and knowing that they are two separate definitions, but they are certainly interrelated. The first thing that I wanted to either refresh or introduce to you all is that restorative work, restorative practices is not a new idea. It has been around for centuries. It is an idea that is critical and very central to Indigenous cultures. And so when we introduce or apply this work in the Western world or very newly in higher education, it's not something that we just discovered. And it's very important to pay homage to the roots of where this comes from. And so when we talk about restorative practices, what we are essentially talking about is this ecological ethos of interrelatedness and collaboration, in that every single person of our community, in our workspaces, in our families, every environment where we do have human life, that everyone is related, everyone has a value, and everyone has something to contribute. And so when we think about situations where we have conflict or tensions, instead of removing that person immediately, creating separation or boundaries, we invite them in to resolve that particular tension. And so in the Western world, we have very easily attached ourselves to separating those individuals and putting them in a time or in a place where they can figure out or resolve those issues and within certain boundaries. Think about the criminal justice system, the way that we set time or space away for rehabilitation that way. And when we think about restorative practices, it is a paradigm shift from one that harms to a justice that heals. And so that is very much true about Indigenous cultures, is that even though someone has created harm or created tension, we want to invite them in to still be a community member to resolve that particular situation. And so in doing so, what we are saying is that we're elevating all voices, voices of survivors, voices of harm parties, voices of those who have created the harm, and our community members, for us to decide together how we're going to move forward or how we're going to redefine that relationship. And bringing it back to the Western world, as I said, this isn't a new way of being that we've just simply discovered and applied to say like, this has some value here. In the literature, we start to see a reemergence of restorative practices around the 1970s in the Western world, but it's very important to know that it certainly has centuries of work in Indigenous cultures. To do this work effectively and to do it well, it's important that those who participate, that they have a certain level of emotional intelligence. And in doing so, you have to be able to, one, be able to name and control your emotions. So there's a self-awareness that certainly has to be present. You have to be able to regulate your emotions as you're in different situations of where you're trying to figure out how to move forward, or in that particular active situation where you are either about to create more or maybe reduce that harm. It also involves motivation. So we do need the willing participation of those involved, because if you force someone to do something, then the outcome certainly will not be as 100% or pure. Empathy is required, and we certainly need a certain level of social skills to be able to navigate those situations. And so when we talk about my office in particular, the Office of Student Accountability and Restorative Practices, what we do is we resolve a number of different situations or issues or incidences on a spectrum of resolution options. I know this is really small there, but essentially where the purple is on the left-hand side, that is our informal resolution. It's the way how most humans would resolve a conflict. conflict if they have not implemented any other type of modality. So one way of resolving a conflict could be by not doing anything at all. You're neglecting it, you're going to ignore that. That's still a choice, and it's still a management choice. It's probably not the best or wisest choice, but it's still something that we tend to do. Where we want to be really proactive and strategic about resolving tensions or conflict is we want to be somewhere in that green space, which is the area of restorative practices. It's a little less than mediation. And just to draw attention to the right-hand side, which is more of the red or orange, that's our formal adjudication on our campus. So if you've ever heard of a disciplinary hearing where there's a panel who decides or makes recommendations to the dean of students, that's what that process looks like. But we understand for us to invite community members to move forward or redefine relationships, that modality may not be successful. And so what we're trying to do is to figure out a way to not only hold others accountable through a process like a restorative justice process, but we're also trying to create different elements that support restorative practices so that we're not just in a place of reacting and then fixing or addressing something, but we're always in a place of this continuum where before wrongdoing even happens, what are we doing to strengthen our relationships and to make them more healthy? I also wanted to introduce this circle here. You'll see some really strongly worded labels like victim or offender, and this is taken directly from the criminal justice industry because this is how they use those labels, but it's still applicable to higher education. And what I want to introduce from this typology is that for a process to be fully restorative, we have to involve all of the parties that were present. We have to involve, we don't use the title victim, but we would say the harmed party. It certainly requires the involvement of the responding party versus the offender. And then we certainly want to involve community members because they may have some opinions or recommendations as to how we may move forward in a very healthy way. And so this Venn diagram very clearly illustrates that if we only have two levels of involvement or just one party's involvement, that it's not really fully restorative. And to be fully restorative, as I mentioned before, we are elevating the voices of all of the individuals or community members that are involved. This next diagram that I want to share with you is something that is also very important when we think about student development theory and how we want to move students along and assisting them, supporting them, challenging them to make more healthy, responsible decisions. And so restorative work comes from a place where we're not doing things to students, we're not trying to punish them, we're not doing it for students, we're not resolving the conflict for them. But when we say the willing participation, we're doing this process with students so that they are very much a part of this process and that they feel supported and they can use different facilitators like those in my office and those in the dean of students to really move forward in a way that they get an input as to what the resolution will be. And the last thing that I want to introduce is this continuum of restorative practices. And so if you've gotten anything from what I've shared in the past couple of minutes, that's that restorative practices is not new. We already use some of these skills. We just need to relabel them and use them in a more strategic way to create healthy outcomes and strengthen healthy relationships. And so what I'm sharing is that we need to be more comfortable using effective statements and using effective questions. And that if a situation becomes more complex, then you can certainly use some of the elements that we have in our office, in my office in particular, OSAR. With effective statements, what I am referring to are those brief comments about how you feel impacted by someone's behavior. We use this in our everyday language. We say statements like, I feel frustrated, or I get excited. We make requests about how we want to engage with one another. We make requests as to what you need in order to be successful or need in order to be heard. None of these statements are new, but what I want to do is to reintroduce them as to a way as how you can be proactively restorative in your everyday language. And so these are statements about observations, feelings, and need or request. The next thing I want to introduce are affective questions. So when we have experienced tension or harm, we then need to interrogate and unpack what happened. And one of the ways that you can do that is by using really good scripted restorative questions. What you see in the highlighted column are some of the most common ways that we would use restorative questions to really get to the root of what is happening. And so one of the first questions that you may ask is, what happened, right? So how did we get here? Another question that you can ask is, what were you thinking at the time that you made that decision? Another question you may ask is, what have been your thoughts since this happened? Obviously, there's been some reflection. What types of internal processes or internal reflection has happened? The next question, who's been affected by what you did? And so this really talks about accountability and puts that in front of your face, talking about taking it outside of just the person, but taking it back to layers. Was there a community member? Was a family member impacted? Was the institution impacted? And then what do you need to do to make it right? This question is really my favorite question, because after we've unpacked the situation, that's great. But as I mentioned before, reintegration back into the community is just as important. So what do we need to do to make it right, to bring others back into the fold so that we no longer say or label someone as, well, yes, we talked about it, but they're still going to be in this lane and we're not really going to involve them. Reintegration and restorative work is just as important. So through these questions, it really does allow for storytelling. It allows for attentive listening. And in my office in particular, we have some really great tools as to how to do this with students. As I mentioned, these are things that we already do on our own, but sometimes there are situations where you may need a third-party neutral person to facilitate these conversations. And this is what we do with students. We can have restorative conferences with students where it's a process where, we may have an incident that may not rise to the threshold of a conduct infraction, but certainly something that if we leave unattended could be something much bigger, and we're trying to be proactive. And so we would meet with students, have an intake meeting, and then bring folks together if they're still willing, and then talk about what are the issues that's happening. How did we get here? What do we need to do to move forward? And what is the reparative agreement that we will have as a result of this to prevent reoccurrences? We also have restorative conversations that are a little more fluid and more informal. So sometimes it's just a matter of unpacking the situation one-on-one with someone, rather than having more of a conference between two or more parties. And both of these tools, both of these modalities are things that we offer within our office and we can support any individual with. So what I want to do now is, I believe we have a case study in the word is losing me, in a handout. And I want us to read over this case study that Ash has dropped into the chat, and using what you've just learned, what you already do as great colleagues, as great people, and think about these incidences. You can take any position that you like, but I would like for you all to discuss what are some of the ways that restorative elements could be introduced, either to gain clarity, to gain understanding, to support someone through their actions, but there are multiple angles that you can take in the discussion as you read this incident as to how restorative practices could really be a tool for understanding and a tool for resolution.
So we're going to go into breakout rooms. Like Dr. Rose said, the Ash put a handout in the chat so you can download the case studies so you don't have to, take a picture of the slide. And you'll have it to refer to in your groups. We'll take about 15 minutes in the breakout room, and there's a lot to read, there's a lot to discuss. And when we get back, we'll have a few minutes to share out from groups that have insights that they'd like to bring to the larger group.
just 10 more seconds until the breakout rooms officially close, and then we will restart. Okay, wonderful. I think everyone should be back on the main stage. And so I know that some of our groups got a little smaller. Some folks were shifted around. Just looking to hear back some feedback from one or two folks, one or two groups, as to how they might apply restorative practices, whether that be effective statements, effective questions, to this particular incident. There are 3 separate incidences. They are related. They continue to escalate. So wanting to hear some feedback as to, or some options as to how one might respond in a restorative manner. And feel free to unmute yourself and to just jump right in.
Oh, we talked to my co-breakout attendee and I talked about it would depend on what is the timeline. Like, is this something that just occurred within 24 to 48 hours versus is it something that, is occurring maybe in, 5 to 10 days afterwards? Because I think that part of those questioning of like, what is the circumstances in which this happened? And then having that reflection on, who possibly was harmed by this, you're not going to necessarily get the reflection from students in the moment, especially if it looks like they maybe were naughty in this moment. They might need time to kind of get their brains back to where it needs to be. And so maybe having it as a 2-part process. So that's what we talked about. It's like how do you do it kind of in the moment, and then how do you do the follow-up where the real reflection can take place, but you can also just use the discussion as a moment of reflection within the first 24 to 48 hours.
Yeah, absolutely. This was left vague on purpose to allow some discussion. Certainly, there'll be a more comprehensive unpacking of actions of behavior a few days or even a few hours later. And what you'll find is that the most challenging thing is that in the moment, what do you do? And so a lot of times, it is harder to respond restoratively in the moment. But when you think about observing behavior and asking questions as to why, who else does this impact? Is there a reason why folks are making certain actions? Those are some of the ways that you can also respond in a restorative manner as well in the moment. And that certainly is definitely way more challenging as opposed to this happening a day ago and you can think, oh, I could have responded this way or I could have said this. Does anyone else have something else to contribute that maybe is the same or maybe different?
Yeah, so our breakout room talked about how, at least reading through the summary, there wasn't a whole lot that the students were doing that is inherently wrong, right? Like listening to loud music isn't inherently wrong, depending on the environment that you're in. It's like the structure around them that affects, right? Like, so if they had been in a setup that allowed for loud music to be played at night, right? Like taking their actions and putting it into an environment where like they would not be harming others, there's not actually a whole lot that they're doing wrong. So helping them understand how their actions, they're just trying to like hang out, play some music, have some fun, taking it out of that vacuum and asking them, to have some empathy, share how or understand how their actions might be affecting others in that situation, but also addressing their need of a place like to gather and have that social interaction, even if it's late at night, right? Like not everybody's a morning person. Some people are night owls. Some people want to hang out at midnight. Like if there's not a place on campus for them to do that, then they can never really have that social gathering.
I think what you mentioned about time and place is really important. The right and wrong, we could argue or debate morality from many different angles. But I think what's more important is the behavior conducive to the environment or conducive for its purpose, or would a reasonable person expect that that this type of behavior would be acceptable? Is it in line with what typically happens in that particular community? And that type of reflection can either happen within the group that is participating in that behavior, or it could happen from someone from like the library personnel, into unpacking as to, is this really the type of behavior that contributes to a learning environment at 11:13 p.m., for example. But very good discussion. I know that there was another question as to how many people were in the group of students. And without knowing the reason for that particular question, I would state that whether it's one person that contributes to a quote unquote disruption or a harm, or 20 people, the harm is the harm, right? And so that's something that we would want to address. I will read through the comments and address some other comments and questions. I want to move us along to the next portion of our presentation, which is about the ethos of care.
Thanks so much, Kanisha. Well, thank you everybody for your participation thus far. So we are going to transition slightly and talk a little bit about the care network, the institution, and the things that inform the work that comes out of and is held through the Office of the Dean of Students. So first and foremost, our hope always is that we are approaching our students holistically and in the spirit of care. We are centering them and their needs as an individual, as often and as willingly able to accept that. We're attempting oftentimes to be proactive with our students and to do that early intervention. And so it comes, it's important to have the understanding that the reach of our office and our ability to support students and community as a whole, it comes from interactions and intervention points with every member of this campus community. So whether you're a faculty member or a staff member, if you are serving as a student and a fellow peer, you give us the opportunity to assist students when they may be in need of some higher level of education. And we really approach our work in an interdisciplinary way. So we are taking information and pieces of the puzzle for a student from as far as we can across. And so we may have the experience of a faculty member and of maybe a coach or an academic advisor, and they're saying, this just didn't sit right with me, and I want to give this information to somebody else to see if there's any support that can be provided to this student. And so in that way, we're very much rooted in our community. It takes all of us together. And probably the hardest part of our job, and I think for many of you who may be instructing our students at times, they're adults, and that is a blessing and a curse sometimes, because as we know, it's up to them to follow up with us and to take and accept any assistance we may be trying to offer them. And as many of us know, as we just rounded out a semester, a lot of times those asks for them come at week 15 or week 17 or 18, when you maybe tried to intervene at week 3 or 4. And so we recognize that even though we may have the best of intentions, sometimes our outreach reaches a student at a time when they are not yet ready or willing to accept. And so one of the most important components of the work that comes out of our office centers around is the care team that we work with. And so our office coordinates weekly conversations with members of the campus community to talk through students and situations that may be right there on our radar for some reason. they are standing out, they're distinguishing themselves in a way that's maybe a little disruptive, a little unbecoming, a little surprising or shocking, right? It's a lot that gut instinct feeling of this just doesn't seem right. Tanisha mentioned earlier, what would a reasonable person do in this situation, or what would they expect to be happening in this situation? And so we're looking for those little flags that people may be experiencing as moments and opportunities for conversation. So our care team, when we meet, it's a bunch of campus partners. You can see from the list on the right-hand side of your screen, we work with a number of campus partners with whom we find that students have a higher frequency of contact, right? And so we use this broader net to cast to say, where is the student and what are they interacting with and what are they doing and what are the ways that we might be able to provide some outreach to them. And we use this model to be consultative, to figure out some intervention strategies, and again, try to reach students in as creative a way as possible. An important connection to this is that we do have members of our student health center and our center for well-being who do attend these calls. We do a lot more sharing to them of information than they can do for us. And we deeply appreciate their ability to consult with us and to assist us as non-clinical staff members provide a higher level of intervention. And so two of the really important overlapping areas that the care team also sort of works within is any student who is leaving for or returning from a hospitalization or a leave of absence that's medical or mental health in nature. They are working with our office to carry through that supportive measure from start to finish. And so we work really closely with the team to help evaluate all of the information that's coming to us by way of their third-party providers to help a student return fully and successfully to the institution. And we know that not everybody is ready for a semester or for a class all of the time. And so the goal is to really help students build in space, take the time that they need for themselves, and be here at as close to 100% as they can be. And sometimes the circumstances that we all are managing, that our students are managing, it can make it really hard to see that, and it can feel very isolated. And so the goal is to really help stretch that boundary. And so the quick snapshot of our purpose, right, and our process, we talked a little bit about this as we've been moving through this afternoon. So we're looking for that early intervention. Every single person on this campus has access to submitting what we call a care report, right? And it's, you are simply sharing with us, there's been an observation, there's been an example, you've had no communication from a student for multiple weeks, even though you've tried to contact them, and you're feeling like they could use a different level of contact, or it's not yours to manage, right? So you want to try to get that into the hands of someone else. So when we receive a report, our office, Justin or myself, we are reading through every single one of those reports, and we are figuring out the action steps that we need to take with the information that we have in front of us. And we rely on all of you to provide those puzzle pieces. The only time we will say, oh my gosh, please don't put this in a message to us first, is if we have really clear, overt signs from a student that they are in distress, whether that's physical distress because they just fell and injured themselves, or it's that they're making clear and overt statements of harm to self or harm to others. That should always be a direct call to AUPD. Even if you are working with a student who is attending a class virtually, or if you are working with a student in another area of the country or the globe, it should still be a call to AUPD, because they will help triage with local police to where that student is in local emergency services. So we absolutely want to know, but we will get that information. So please remember that if you're feeling that a student is unsafe, or that they are a threat to themselves or someone else, we get AUPD connected to them. And so the ways in which we hope to call you into this work with us is by helping give you some strategies around recognizing, responding, and referring students. Right? So when are they in distress? What could distress mean? What does it mean for me as a person to lean in and step into that conversation with them and to hear how they might be feeling? And then ultimately handing them off to us so that you don't have to carry the burden of that conversation, that experience.
Thanks, Ash. Um, so this idea of calling in to our work is really important because as you can see, there's myself and Ash, and we have two other case managers on our team, but there's thousands of students at AU. So you all are having much more frequent and in-depth interactions with students than we most likely have had. So it's really important for you to recognize the signs that students are giving you, inviting you either purposefully or inadvertently to engage with them about how to help connect them to resources that can help them, as well as the opportunities that you have to use the skills that you all have within yourselves to initiate these kinds of conversations until you're able to get the student to the resource like the Dean of Students Office or other resources. So some invitations that you might notice in students, whether it's in classes or in your interactions with them in your advising units or wherever the case may be, if you notice a substantial change in their academic performance. So the example that Ash gave, you haven't seen the student in a while, or maybe they went from getting all A's on quizzes to, zeros on quizzes. That's a sign that probably there should be a conversation. Obviously, direct statements about hurting themselves, about hurting others should be directed to AUPD. But sometimes students might make statements such as, my family member passed away, or my family member lost their job and now we don't know how we're going to pay for school. Those kinds of statements would be things that would be great for care reports, as well as for, initiating that conversation, because hopefully you've built rapport with that student and might be able to get a little bit more out of them before you even submit the report, so that DOS can have as much information as possible to be working from. If you notice any change in their work or social activities, so perhaps a student is saying that they haven't been able to get assignments done because they're working, 50 hours a week, that might be a question. Well, how are you a full-time student and working 50 hours a week? Exaggerated personality traits. So if they become withdrawn, or maybe they become very animated and become agitated in class conversations, or maybe are making statements to others that are a little bit more harsh than you're used to them making in your class discussions. We hear a lot of times from other students who've noticed these things in students. So if you hear about, Bobby comes to you and says, I'm worried about Sally because, every time we go to TDR, she doesn't eat anything. That would be a conversation that you would want to start with those students. Physical changes, sometimes students might start coming into class looking more disheveled, or you might notice a smell, or those kinds of things are certainly things to note. If they're having trouble engaging in class discussions, or perhaps concentrating on assignments. And then, of course, significant life events. So things like a death in the family, or maybe a loved one has to be deployed. Those kinds of things are all great times to pause and try to invite the student into a conversation, whether through your office hours or maybe after class. And then opportunities that you have to engage in this intervention. And you're doing a lot of this already. So I have a lot of, we do a lot of consultations with faculty in the Dean of Students Office, and a lot of the work that we're doing is really just validating the faculty members and saying, yeah, you're actually on the right path, having, listening to the student, asking them questions, like you're gonna do a great job. So you actually have all of these skills within yourselves, but active listening, so really trying to seek to understand what's going on with the student while you're listening to them, and not just thinking about what what your answer is going to be, but kind of hearing what what's going on and then using the fullness of what they're saying to think through all of these next things. So understanding how to explore what resources are available to help address students' concerns. You as a faculty member or an academic advisor or a coach are not expected to be able to, you know, have a magic wand that will solve every student's problem. We are at a university with many, many offices and resources that are here to help students. So helping those students that you're working with navigate what those resources are and also knowing when and how to appropriately refer a student. We get a lot of questions in the Dean of Students office from faculty and staff. Is it okay for me to tell the student to go to the Center for Wellbeing Programs? Yes, the answer is yes. You should be able to refer students to any resource at AU. You don't need permission from the Dean of Students office to do that. Please do that. That is totally appropriate. And you can put that in your care report and say, hey, Bobby seems depressed. I referred him to go to the Center for Wellbeing Programs. It might be good if Dean of Students also reaches out. We will get that report. Great. To connect the student to a resource, and we will also try to make contact with the student to see if there's any additional ways we can be of support to that student. If you're an academic advisor or a coach, talking through with students whether they might be eligible to take a reduced course load to maybe reduce some of the stress that they're encountering, doing more structured academic interventions. So perhaps seeing if the student needs to seek accommodations through the Academic Support and Access Center, or seeking academic coaching from our wonderful coaches through ASAC. And in your role as a faculty member, you also have the purview to offer flexibility if that's appropriate. So maybe an extension on an assignment, or you know, a different way of delivering an assignment so that the learning outcome is still met, but it addresses whatever the student's concern is. And of course, you are trying to have an eye for equity, and this is why it is so important, as the people who are interacting with students the most, that you all are the ones making the decisions, and that it's not the Dean of Students office, because we don't know, you know, is this the 8th time that Bobby has been sick, or is it, you know, the first time that they're experiencing this in your class? Being clear about your expectations and policies, both in writing in your syllabus and in any email communications or conversations that you're having with students, is essential. And also knowing about resources for students through policies. So temporary leave of absence, also the ability for students to take a medical withdrawal, or to withdraw from 1 or 2 classes, what the deadline for that is. We get often a lot of emails from students at the end of the semester saying, Professor Smith told me in week 10, or told me, sorry, in week 12 that I should just withdraw from this class, which is not possible after week 10. So it causes a lot of consternation for the students and for the faculty member as well. And I also want to note about alcohol and other drug assessments. So whenever we receive a report that is related to alcohol and other drugs, we usually refer that case, if it's purely about alcohol and other drugs, to a counselor in the Center for Wellbeing Programs who specializes in alcohol and other drugs. So oftentimes students in particular are worried about maybe telling that somebody or they themselves are experiencing difficulties with alcohol and other drugs. Our goal is to help students get the help that they need. So those reports are not handled in a punitive way, unless they're pervasive and repetitive, and then, you know, the conversations get more intense, but the initial conversations are usually about how to get the student the help that they need. Next slide. So we're about to go into breakout rooms again. Before we do that, I want to go through this case study as a group. I'm going to read through each part because there are 4 distinct parts, and I think it would be helpful for your breakout conversations if you handled each part individually as you're thinking through the questions. So part 1, Jane attended the first 2 class sessions and then did not attend class or respond to Professor Smith's emails for the next 4 weeks. Jane is still showing up on the class roster, and other students in the class have told Professor Smith that they've seen Jane in TDR recently. Part 2. Professor Smith comes, or I'm sorry, Jane comes to class 7, and Professor Smith pulls Jane aside to find out what's been going on and where Jane has been for the past several weeks. Jane tells Professor Smith that she has been, quote, dealing with some mental health stuff. Part 3. Jane misses classes 8 and 9, but comes to class 10. She has still not submitted any of the assignments for the semester. Jane misses class 11. Her partner for the final project tells Professor Smith that they have not been able to reach Jane to divide up the work, and Jane has not responded to Professor Smith's emails either. And then part 4, Jane comes to class 12 and tells Professor Smith she is still, quote, dealing with mental health stuff, end quote. She tells Professor Smith she has not sought medical attention and she has not met with anyone from the Office of the Dean of Students or her academic advisor. So we'll go into the breakout rooms. You'll have about 15 minutes again to talk through each part. And I would suggest kind of handling each one like one at a time, and then maybe having a larger discussion about everything that's going on with Jane and Professor Smith this semester.
Hey Justin, Jenny Axe says that I'm not sure I have been assigned to a breakout room.
Thank you. We will take care of that. Hey, looks like folks are repopulating into the main room. Um, would any or either of the groups like to share what their thoughts were after reading through and thinking about part one of Jane and Professor Smith's case study? Was anyone concerned after part one?
Hi, this is Bridget. I think in our group, we all agreed that at least after a student missing 2 weeks, we would fill out a care report. Susan's question of, can, anyone on the add drop period, a comment on how students might show up or not. That is a question, right? Because they could miss the first 2 classes and then they've missed 4. So we were talking about that a little bit. But that definitely, if they miss 2 weeks in a row, like weeks 4 and 5, that we would be, or 3 and 4, excuse me, the 2 weeks after add drop, that we would be submitting a care report and possibly contacting their counselor.
Thanks, Richard. Amanda?
Hi. So as Justin knows, I have had similar situations to this happen in the last few years. I teach mostly first and second year students. So unfortunately, I probably have something happen like this about once a semester. And I usually start out with the academic alerts and leaning on course policies, especially in the first few weeks of class, making it really clear, like, here's why attendance matters. There's some really great language core has about how you are more likely to meet the learning outcomes for a course and be a more active part of the academic community that I really lean on. So I at least try to weave this into the class all throughout the semester, that and doing things like the homeworks and keeping up assignments and regularly going to office hours. So I think one, just like setting that precedent from the beginning. That said, if you're not going to class, you're not going to get that information. So I need to document this in some way. So I'd be filing academic alerts for attendance, especially early core classes. We have pretty clear attendance guidelines. So after the third absence, I will always file an academic alert just to document it for the student. There are some students who miss anywhere from 6 to 9 classes, which if you look at 28 classes, that's a huge portion of class to miss. And students are unlikely to meet the learning outcomes for the class overall because they don't know enough of the material, and so much of the learning in first year classes happens in the classroom. So that would also be something I could note in academic alerts. I would also say my approach would change throughout the semester. I'd try to reach out via email. I'd be filing academic alerts. I would say the mental health thing is tricky for me because honestly, teaching first year students, I hear the phrase mental health stuff from them or anxiety probably every single day. So I wouldn't necessarily file a care report the first time I hear mental health, the second time, most certainly. So by the time part 4 would come, I probably will have filed at least 1 care report, if not 2, especially by part 3 and 4. I would say part 3 would be a care report, part 4, most certainly a care report, and academic alerts, unfortunately, throughout the whole process. So
Thank you, Amanda. And this is actually not a case based on any of the students that you and I have worked on, but it is.
I know, but I was just like, oh,
it's a student that I had in one of my classes once. So I am Professor Smith, and I don't even know if I did it right. So I'm very much appreciating everybody's comments in this. Let's actually think through just thinking about part 4. Did any of your groups come up with like what would be the final outcome for the student for the class? Because week 12 is basically the end of the semester. Laura.
Might actually add, if folks are about to talk, is that you can also weave in some restorative questions to help understand the student's perspective or their journey over the course of the semester.
Great suggestion. Get out of my brain. Laura, were you going to say something?
Yes, our group didn't actually get as far as part 4,
Okay.
but I might possibly suggest considering taking an incomplete for the class, depending upon how much of it, possibly taking an incomplete for the class.
Okay. Bridget?
Oh, You saw me go off of mute. Thank you. I'm going to say that that is what is always so challenging for me is that if they don't have a C or above, we're not really supposed to give them an incomplete. But then I often feel pressure to maybe, I feel pressure around that C requirement when students have really had challenges. And then, as you know, I'm really interested in how we can create different pathways for neurodiverse learners. So then I take into consideration those aspects. But also, I'm just a professor. I really am not an expert in any of those things. And so, anyways, my convoluted way of saying I get really conflicted around it, giving it incomplete or not because of that regulation of C or better.
Yeah, you're not alone. Amanda?
I was going to say, thinking too about Bridget's point about neurodiverse learners, I often try to get the student into a meeting during office hours. If there are students who are less comfortable with in-person office hours, a Zoom meeting. But I really just kind of want to hear like what's going on. Like, obviously you don't have to tell me anything, but can I point you towards resources? Try to at least start a conversation. The new thing that I started this year, and I don't know if this has helped or hurt, was to ask the student about their own educational background, and what are their expectations and why they come to AU, and to start to think through some of the more complicated questions, especially if they're struggling, because I think that most certainly matters in these situations. I don't know if that has worked well because at times students share way too much. So we shall find out.
Thank you. And like I said, I am Professor Smith. I can tell you that, I've experienced all of the things that you all have talked about throughout the various moments in the semester. And unfortunately in this situation, the student ended up earning the grade that they had earned, which is an F in the course. But I definitely thought through what other options there might be. Before we wrap up, and I really want to just say how much I appreciate everyone's engagement in our breakout sessions and in the session overall, I did want to share this year in review from last academic year, fall 2022 to spring 2023. This is a graphic that shows a summary of the care reports that we received over almost 3,900 care reports last year, for about 2,500 unique students. So there's a lot of students who are getting support through the Data Students Office through the help of you all in the community, letting us know that students are in need of help. And I do also want to flag the number in the lower left-hand corner, 5,628. That's the number of letters that we sent to faculty on behalf of students last year for being sick, etc. I anticipate this is going to be greatly reduced this year because you all have been engaging so wonderfully with the updated academic regulation in terms of class attendance. So we have not had to be as involved with letting people know that students have a cold. But we do appreciate all the reports that you are sending to us for students who are in other sorts of distress. So again, thank you all so much. And I don't think we have time for questions. I know Nabila has one thing that she needs to tell everybody.
Yes, thank you. I just dropped the link for our survey to collect your feedback in the chat. I'm also going to share the QR code for around 30 seconds so that you can scan it. And I want to thank everyone for the lively discussion and for joining us.
Thank you, Dean of Students, folks.
Thank you all.
Okay, I think everyone had the opportunity to scan the QR code and you also have the link. I will end the meeting now. Thank you everyone again. Have a good day.